Sicilian with 3, white bishop to e2. Side 1. The opening we're going to look at is a line for white against the Sicilian defence. I played it quite persistently from October 1973 to October 1974, and it performed well, even at Grandmaster level. It's a very sound line, innocuous at first sight, but one which can suddenly burst into activity. There are 2 promising gambits lodged among the variations. But first, let's get an idea of the basic principles of the opening and how it came about. Most openings are born out of dissatisfaction, even defeat. My dissatisfaction came out of playing the Mora Gambit. After one game in particular, against Nigel Holloway, I began to think that Mora-type positions were not for me. I was not displeased with the actual gambit itself, but with black's sidestepping maneuver, knight to f6. If you'll have the board set up in the initial position, we can look at this line. White plays 1, pawn to e4. Black, pawn to c5. Now white can move 2, pawn to c3. I know that the Mora Gambit doesn't quite go like this. White generally plays pawn to d4 first and then pawn to c3, but for the sake of clarity we'll look at it this way round. White's plan is to continue with pawn to d4, and thus set up a broad pawn centre, with pawns on d4 and e4, just like Grandma used to make it. Unfortunately, however, black generally puts a spanner in the works with knight to f6, attacking the pawn on e4. White has little choice but to push on, pawn to e5. Then black goes knight to d5. Now white pushes pawn to d4. And after black pawn takes on d4, white pawn takes on d4, what have we got? It's true that white has his pawn centre, but it's not the proud pair on d4 and e4, which would have covered 4 central squares on the 5th rank between them. One of the pawns, the king pawn, has even had to move forward to the 5th, leaving the d5 square firmly occupied by a black knight. Now, I'm not saying that white has a bad game here. He's won many times from this position. But I felt that pushing on with the king pawn was quite a large concession so early in the game, and wouldn't it be a nice idea to preserve options and maintain the pawns at e4 and d4 if possible? In the position on the board, besides the book continuation for black pawn to d6, I think black has another useful line in black pawn to b6. He can then put his bishop to work on the weakened long white diagonal. I have included a couple of games in the attached literature. Gavindashvili versus Kushnir, Women's World Championship 1972, and Markland versus Basman, Wollacombe 1973, where black tried this type of manoeuvre out and had the better of drawn games. So let's go back to move 1. Set up the pieces for the start of the game. Switch off if necessary to do so. What about developing a few pieces before we try and set up our pawn center? Begin 1. Pawn to e4. Black pawn to c5. White knight to f3. Black pawn to d6. White bishop to e2. This is the start position for the variation. It's hardly surprising that the line has been disregarded up to now. Bishop to e2 looked such a quiet move, hardly the precursor of wild gambit play. Now if black does nothing in particular, white is going to castle and set up his pawn center. Quite often you find that black does do nothing, and you've set up your pawn center before he knows what's happened. But more of that later. We'll assume here that black is feeling stroppy and puts the question with knight to f6, hitting at the e-pawn. Now white is in a dilemma. Advancing the pawn to e5 would fritter away his opening advantage. He could defend the king's pawn by knight to c3, but this too isn't quite what he wants, because he can then no longer move the c-pawn to c3 to support the d-pawn when it gets to d4. And white pawn to d3, well, we were trying to play pawn to d4 eventually, so that isn't right. So has white any other way of defending the king's pawn? Switch off and see if you can find a way. In fact, white has got a way. For white pawn to c3. Now if black carries on with knight takes on e4, white plays queen to a4 check, picking up the knight. This, by the way, is quite a good money spinner for 5-minute games and simultaneous displays. Please replace the black knight on f6, white's pawn on e4, and the white queen on d1. White's move pawn to c3 also fitted into his basic plan of setting up a broad pawn center. Now black, if he is wide awake, will not take on e4 with his knight. He may play knight to c6, clearly a good dual-purpose move. As well as developing a piece, black also blocks the line to his king and threatens knight takes on e4. Now white has to find a way to defend the king's pawn again. Switch off and find a move for him. In this position, white carries straight on with his plan and goes pawn to d4. Once again, black knight takes on e4 is not possible. This time because white then pushes on with pawn to d5, hitting the black knight on c6. This knight has to move, and then comes knockout, queen to a4 check, picking up the other knight on e4. Now let's return to the position after 5 white pawn to d4. So we place the black knights on c6 and f6, the white pawns on d4 and e4, and the white queen on d1. Black can here play pawn takes on d4. White pawn takes on d4, and then black knight takes on e4. White pushes on to d5, pawn to d5. But this time the position is different. Instead of moving his knight, black has a Zwischenzug here. He plays black queen to a5 check. Now, whatever white does, black is going to move his knight from c6, and white will not have his winning check on a4 anymore. So white's next move is 8 white knight to c3. We are now in one of the main gambit lines of the variation, and are following Basman versus Steen, Hastings International Tournament 1973. As the game was fairly short, ending in a mate on move 26, we might as well go through it. Black plays knight takes on c3. White pawn takes on c3. Now black can't play queen takes on c3 check because of white bishop to d2, which leaves 2 black pieces under attack. So we place the black queen on a5, the white pawn on c3, and the white bishop on c1. So where would you now put the black knight on c6? Switch off here. Black chose knight to e5. I don't think his other possible moves, knight to d8 and knight to b8, are any worse. They just bring different variations in their train. After black's knight to e5, white played slightly inaccurately, knight takes on e5. Black replied, queen takes on c3 check. White bishop to d2. Black queen takes on e5. And white castled. Here black took the third pawn with queen takes on d5. As you can see, there isn't much left of white's pawn centre, but on the other hand, there isn't much of black's development either, so the game is very finely balanced. After some thought, white moved rook to b1, leaving a fourth pawn on prise. Not that black dared take it, in view of the threatened bishop to b5 check. Now the position is a very critical one. Please switch off and study it a while. Black chose pawn to e6, which eventually led to his defeat. I think black pawn to a6 might have been a little better than the move played, but perhaps the best chance was to play black pawn to f6 to set up a central phalanx with a later pawn to e5. Certainly, the play after black pawn to f6 could be quite fascinating. But let us return to the game. Put the black pawns back to a7 and f7. After black pawn to e6, white replied bishop to b5 check. Black bishop to d7, white bishop takes on d7 check, black king takes on d7. Now black's king has been dislodged, and white gave another check by queen to a4. Black moved king to d8. Perhaps you would like to switch off and look for white's next move. White played 16, rook to b5. Almost the winning move, for now he can bring all his pieces into action. Black cannot take the bishop on d2 because of white rook takes on b7, threatening queen to d7 mate. Now we've placed the white rook on b5, white bishop on d2, black queen on d5, and the black pawn on b7. After white rook to b5, black had to bring his queen back to c6, still keeping the guard on the b-pawn. White now gained another tempo by rook to c1. And black moved queen to a6. White continued hunting the hapless piece by rook to a5. And black replied queen to d3. Please switch off and consider the position. White played 21, bishop to e3. I think he has to play this move because if he left the bishop on prise, black would take and then start threatening back rank mates. Black could find nothing better here than pawn to d5. And white trundled in with rook takes on a7. Black captured, rook takes on a7. White queen takes on a7. And black bishop to a3. Can you work out a good sequence of moves for white here? Switch off. The last moves were queen to b8 check, black king to e7, white bishop to g5 check, black pawn to f6, white queen takes on b7 check, black king to d6, and white queen to c7 mate. About 6 months later, at the Enfield Congress in August 1974, I had a very similar game with Scheuring, even down to the final mating attack. Interestingly enough, both Steen and Scheuring stated after the game that they had missed the check on g5 with the bishop, which keeps the black king from going out to f6. Having introduced you to the line, I think I ought to expand a little on the basic concepts underlying it. So far you know the plan is to create a pawn center at d4 and e4. And though you'll find many of the older books of chess tending to leave off there, with the unspoken assumption that white has a won game, you don't find modern books so unreservedly in favour of them. You have to be able to use the pawn center properly, otherwise it can even become a liability. A pawn center is good because it tends to restrict your opponent to the bottom 3 ranks. It's bad if you've had to spend too much time setting it up, or if it becomes a target of attack. If you'll set up the board in the initial position, we'll look at an example of white building a pawn center unhindered. This occurred in the game Basman Nicholas, Ilford 1974. 1. White pawn to e4. Black pawn to c5. White knight to f3. Black knight to c6. White bishop to e2. Black pawn to g6. White pawn to c3. Black bishop to g7. As you can see, black is not directly contesting the center for the moment. White moves pawn to d4. Black pawn takes on d4. White pawn takes on d4. Black pawn to d6. White knight goes to c3. Black bishop to d7, white castles, and black knight to f6. So far, everything has gone according to plan. In fact, white has set up an almost model position for this variation. However, it is not always so easy to transpose from your model opening into a one middle game. Please switch off and consider the position. Here white decided to push forward immediately. He played pawn to d5, attacking the knight. Black had a choice between knight to b8 and knight to e5, and chose knight to e5, giving himself doubled pawns in exchange for more central control. White played knight takes on e5, black pawn takes on e5. Please switch off here and study the position. As is so often the case, the subsequent play is determined by the pawn structure. By placing his pawn at d5, white established a space advantage in the direction of the queen's side, and that is where his main prospects lie. Particularly, it's the black squares of the queen side which interest him, for the black bishop on g7 is completely unable to defend them, since it is blocked in by its own pawns on e7 and e5. The remainder of the game can be found in the attached leaflet. It's game number 6. I suggest you play through it carefully before going on to the next section. Switch off. If you've looked at the rest of the game, we can go on. Please set up the initial position. Now play 1 white pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3. The variation is notable for the multiplicity of lines, particularly for black. After white's second move, black has at least 8 reasonable replies, and after white's third move, bishop to e2, black has again a wide choice. All the same, I think I boiled down the variations to 2 basic types: the ones where black plays pawn to d6, which often brings a king's fianchetto, and the ones where he plays pawn to e6, which is often followed by black pawn to d5 and a French type of position. On this side, we'll be looking at the pawn to d6 lines. On the next side, the lines with black pawn to e6. Now I would like to look at a couple of variations whose chief feature is their similarity to other openings. In this case, the Ruy-Lopez and the English. You may already have noticed that my pawn sacrifice in the first game we looked at is very similar to one of Bronstein's in a different variation, and I have given a game, Hug versus Szabo, in the accompanying leaflet, so that you can make comparisons. The next example is very similar to the Ruy-Lopez. After white knight to f3, black plays pawn to d6, white bishop to e2, black pawn to a6, white castles, black knight to c6, white pawn to c3, black knight to f6, white pawn to d4, black pawn to e6. We're following Basman versus Cardoso, Woolacombe 1973. You'll note that because he played pawn to a6, black didn't have the option in this game of taking on e4 with the knight. Now white plays knight on b1 to d2, as his e-pawn really was attacked this time. Black bishop to e7, white rook to e1, black queen to c7, white bishop to d3. The loss of time with the bishop is not important here, since white has set up his pawn centre and black is exercising very little pressure against it. At this point, black became worried lest white should be intending to drive a wedge into his position with pawn to e5. So he himself played black pawn to e5. White played pawn takes on c5, and black pawn takes on c5. Now we have a position very similar to the Re-Lopez, except that white's bishop has not gone gallivanting all over the queen's side, encouraging black's pawns to expand. White now played pawn to a4, which underlined his advantage. As well as the traditional Re-Lopez possibility of exploiting the weak d5 square, he also has the pivotal c4 square for his knight and his bishop. Black castled kingside here, and white moved knight to c4. Black bishop to g4, white knight to e3, fixing on the d5 and f5 squares. Black moved rook on a8 to d8. Please switch off and study the position. I think white should have called black's bluff here by playing knight takes on g4, since black pawn to c4 would only lose black a pawn in the end, a conclusion which you may like to verify by your own analyses. White actually played a blunder, after which the game lost its theoretical interest. The second line which we should look at bears a strong resemblance to the Keres line against the English. As you may know, this was a line for black, which Tull unsuccessfully tried against Botvinnik in one of the revenge match games of 1961. It was also tried, this time successfully, by Korchnoi against Larsen at the last interzonal tournament in Leningrad. If you'll set up the original position switch off if necessary. We can look at the line. 1 white pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black knight to c6, white bishop to e2, black pawn to g6. White pawn to c3. And now black knight to f6. The basic idea of the Keres variation is that black's fianchetto is less effective against a Moa setup. So white here pushes on to e5, pawn to e5, black knight to d5, white pawn to d4. Black pawn takes on d4. Please switch off and study the position. This position you can readily find with reversed colours if you look up modern chess openings on the English. The only difference is that white has an extra move, which is used playing bishop to e2. The advantage for white here lies not so much in having developed a piece, as in being only a move away from castling, and hence bringing his rook into action. White has many promising lines here, but the one I'll mention serves to underline the last point made. Let's say white plays queen to b3, as Tal used to play, hitting the knight on d5. Black knight goes to b6, and white pawn takes on d4. Black bishop to g7, white castles, black castles, white rook to d1. The rook swings into action straight away. Black pawn to d6, white bishop to f4. Please switch off and study this position. Now black cannot play bishop to e6 here because of white pawn to d5. So white maintains its advantage in the centre. I've given some possible lines in this variation in the accompanying literature. If you wish to investigate the positions further, I suggest you keep a copy of MCO on the English handy in order to make comparisons. The next question to be answered is, can black, by varying his move order, prevent white from either setting up his pawn centre on d4 and e4, or transposing into positions already known to be favourable for him? This problem was investigated quite carefully at the Hastings International Tournament 1973-4. One possibility suggested was an improvement on Basman's Steen. If you'll set up the initial position, we can have a look at it. White plays 1 pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black pawn to d6, white bishop to e2, black knight to f6, white pawn to c3. And now, instead of black knight to c6, black could play bishop to d7, threatening knight takes on e4. Then, however, I think white could simply play pawn to d3, and then he'd bring his knight on b1 to d2, and play pawn to d4 a move later. Black's bishop to d7 is rather passive in this position. A more dangerous plan was developed by the Canadian Grandmaster Duncan Suttles. Please replace the black bishop on c8, white's knight on d2 back to b1, and put the white pawn on d2. Let black play pawn to g6 here. White castles, black bishop to g7. This is a very precise series of moves. Black is delaying the development of his queen's knight until after he is castled, and this has the effect of holding up white's pawn to d4, for he hasn't got his little combination based on hitting the knight on c6 with pawn to d5. There follows white rook to e1, black castles, white bishop to f1, black knight to c6. Please switch off and study this position. White could here have played pawn to d4 straight away, but he feared, quite rightly, that black would swap pawns on d4 and then play bishop to g4, pinning his knight on f3. So, as in the Ruy-Lopez, he prepared pawn to d4 by playing white pawn to h3. Black now blocked with pawn to e5. Please switch off and consider this position. White played pawn to d4 here, and after mass exchanges on that square, black put his rook on e8, and white found he was dangerously lagging in development. So it looks like white ought to get a bit of development before trying to open things up. Black himself is threatening pawn to d5. White pawn takes on d5. Black queen takes on d5, with the threat of black pawn to e4. Now we place the white pawn on e4, the black pawns on d6 and e5, and the black queen on d8. White may play pawn to d3 here, which can't be bad. He has an old Indian setup, 2 moves in hand. But he may want to try and keep his king's bishop active instead. So try white bishop to b5 instead of pawn to d3. If then black bishop to d7, white pawn to a4, black pawn to a6, then white could move bishop to c4. Sicilian with 3, white bishop to e2. Side 2. On side 1, we looked at black lines with pawn to d6. On this side, we'll be concentrating more on pawn to e6 by black. In these variations, white often has to push on to e5, but because he has delayed white pawn to c3, this gives him a number of possibilities not available in the normal setups. As the first side began with a pawn sacrifice, we might as well begin the second side with another one. The first time this one occurred was in the game Basman versus Hutchins, Woolacombe 1973. Please have the board set up. Switch off if necessary. 1. White pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black pawn to e6, white bishop to e2, black knight to c6, white castles, black knight to f6. Now we have the same sort of dilemma as before. Here, if white dallies with white pawn to d3, black is ready with pawn to d5. Replace the black pawn on d7 and the white pawn on d2. So white pushes on straight away with pawn to e5. Black naturally goes knight to g4 with a double attack on the e-pawn. You might like to switch off and consider white's next move. It seems that white has to lose a pawn. If he plays white pawn to d4, black pawn takes on d4, white bishop to f4, black pawn to d6. Looks quite strong enough. Now we've placed the white bishop back on c1, the white pawn on d2, and black pawns on c5 and d7. White can turn his pawn loss into a sacrifice. He played 6, pawn to b4, leaving black a choice of captures. Please switch off and consider which one you would choose. The worst capture for black would be knight on g4 takes on e5. White would simply continue knight takes on e5, black knight takes on e5, white pawn takes on c5, and now black bishop takes on c5 is impossible because of white pawn to d4. Please replace the white knight on f3, the white pawns on e5, b4 and d2, black knights on g4 and c6, black bishop on f8, black pawn on c5. Black may also capture by black knight takes on b4. Then white may play pawn to d4. Black pawn takes on d4. White queen takes on d4, hitting at the knight on g4. No one has ever played this line against me, though. Please switch off and consider this position. Now replace the white queen on d1, the white pawns on d2 and b4, the black knight on c6, and the black pawn on c5. Most people play black pawn takes on b4, and white reinforces the e-pawn by pawn to d4. With this reinforcement, albeit at the cost of a pawn, black's knight on g4 begins to look a bit offside. It has only one retreat square at the present, to h6, and that might be met by white bishop takes on h6, disabling black's kingside pawns. Black went in for a French formation here with black pawn to d5. I think this is better than black pawn to d6, because black would then always have to reckon with the possibility of white putting a knight on e4 later on. After black's pawn to d5, white decided, perhaps incorrectly, to double black's h-pawn straight away. He played white pawn to h3, black knight to h6, white bishop takes on h6, black pawn takes on h6. This doubling of pawns makes at any rate white's material disadvantage negligible. White played pawn to a3, and you might like to switch off here and consider the position. Black here put a spanner in the works with black queen to a5, and white saw that his expansion on the queen side was not to be unhindered. He wanted to play knight on f3 to d2, but then the d-pawn would be on prise. So he played first white queen to d3. Black moved bishop to d7, and white knight on f3 went to d2. Besides planning to dislodge the black queen by white knight to b3, white also intends a snap kingside attack, say bishop to h5 followed by queen to f3 or pawn to f4 to f5. Black continued calmly with rook to c8, white knight to b3, black queen to b6, white bishop to h5. Now came black rook to g8. Black is not so interested in keeping his extra material as in obtaining active counterplay. It's clear that white is in difficulties here. His queenside pieces are still tied up, and he did not like to play pawn takes on b4 because of black knight takes on b4 with an attack on the c2 pawn. Now we place the white pawn on a3, the black pawn on b4, and the black knight on c6. At the same time, black is making good use of the open file for his rooks, and his bishops, particularly the black squared bishop, have good futures. White actually took the pawn on h7. Queen takes on h7. Black played rook to g7, and white queen moved to d3. Perhaps you'd like to switch off here and consider black's next move. During the game, I was very concerned about the possibility of black knight takes on e5. White pawn takes on e5. Black bishop to b5, skewering the queen and the rook. White plays queen to d1 to maintain the guard on the c-pawn. Black bishop takes on f1. White king takes on f1. And now black rook to g5, hitting the e-pawn. If white plays pawn to f4 here, black can even play rook takes on h5. White queen takes on h5. Black rook takes on c2, threatening mate on f2. Please switch off and consider this position. White can block by, say, knight on b1 to d2. But then black pawn takes on a3, and white's extra piece hardly looks impressive, apart from the fact that black has full equivalent in pawns for it. However, black missed this continuation, and after a bitter struggle, white eventually triumphed. The remainder of the game may be found in the pamphlet supplied. After this game, I came to the conclusion that it was better to delay white pawn to h3 and the capture bishop takes on h6. But just let black's knight stew a little on g4. White should expand immediately by pawn to a3. See, for example, my game against Franklin at the Athenaeum 101 tournament. The gambit has its counterpart in the English opening. One sample, the game Rzhevsky-Bellon, is given in the pamphlet. Black can also decline the gambit in a number of ways. One way is to move the knight on f6 to d5 instead of to g4. This was tried against me by Sherman in the last round of the Islington Congress 1973. Please reset the pieces for the beginning of a game. Switch off if necessary. The game went 1. Pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black knight to c6, white bishop to e2, black knight to f6, white pawn to e5, black knight to d5, white castles kingside. You might like to switch off here and consider how white would answer black queen to c7. Have you looked at it? Good. Let's go on to the next line. Black played here 5 pawn to d6 to challenge white's advanced pawn. White pawn takes on d6, and here black did not recapture on d6, but played pawn to e5. This is an ambitious plan. Black intends to recapture with the bishop on d6 and get a Maroczy bind in reverse, with his two pawns on e5 and c5. Perhaps you would switch off here and consider what white should play. White has an interesting move, pawn to d4, at his disposal, giving black a choice of 3 separate captures. Let's consider them one by one. The move least likely to succeed is black knight takes on d4, because of white knight takes on d4, black pawn on c5 takes on d4, white pawn to c4. Taking advantage of the fact that black cannot recapture this pawn en passant because his knight on d5 is hanging. The black knight retreats to f6, and then white plays pawn to c5, guarding his friend on d6 and making it very difficult for black to get his king out of the centre. Now reset the position after white's pawn to d4. That means a white knight on f3, white pawns on d4 and c2, black knights on c6 and d5, and a black pawn on c5. Here, black pawn on c5 takes on d4, fails for the same reason as given before. So that leaves only one move. Black pawn on e5 takes on d4. Please switch off and consider what white should play here. White rook to e1 looks a promising continuation. It works against nearly everything, but black can reply. Queen takes on d6. Then none of white's discovered checks bring him instant victory, and black is going to play bishop to e7 next move, and castle kingside, with quite a good defense. The thing is, white is himself lagging in development. He still has to get his queenside pieces out. A possible line might be white bishop to c4 check, black bishop to e7, white knight to g5, black castles kingside, and now white knight takes on h7. Please switch off and consider this position. The position seems rather unclear. Perhaps white could do better. So return to the position before white played white rook to e1. That means white rook on to f1, white bishop to e2, white pawn goes on to d6, and white knight goes on to f3. A black pawn on h7, black queen on d8, black rook on h8, black king on e8, and black bishop on f8. Try white bishop to c4 straight off. Black queen takes on d6, and now white knight to g5. This threatens the old bone crusher, knight takes on f7. So black plays bishop to e6. White knight takes on e6, and black pawn takes on e6. Now white has gained the two bishops, and given black a weak pawn on e6. Carry on with white queen to h5 check, black pawn to g6, white queen to h3, black castles queenside, and white rook to e1. White should have good compensation for his pawn. I've given some more lines in the pamphlet if you'd like to look more deeply into the variations. If black prefers the quiet life, he can play instead of 6 black pawn to e5, black pawn to e6, as was tried by Robert Bellin at the Athenaeum 101 tournament. After that, white can gain perhaps only a slight advantage. I think we can now leave the consideration of pawn sacrifices and turn to French types of position. One such occurred at the Woolacombe International Tournament 1973. Black was the Hungarian Grandmaster Bilek. Please reset the initial position. Switch off if necessary. The game began. 1 pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black pawn to d6, white bishop to e2, black knight to f6, white pawn to c3, black knight to c6, and white pawn to d4. Now black declined the offered pawn and played simply pawn to e6. White guarded the pawn by playing knight on b1 to d2. Black replied pawn to d5, white pawn to e5, and black knight to d7. By transposition of moves, we have got into the advanced variation of the French defence. White now castled, and black played bishop to e7. White moved his bishop to d3, putting it on a more active diagonal. Black played queen to b6 to put pressure on white's queen's pawn. I think here he might have considered black pawn takes on d4 instead. Then white would have to have recaptured with the pawn on c3. And though black is cramped, he can at least hope for the endgame, when white's exposed pawn on d4 might count for something. But after the move played, white sets up a position well known to be favourable for him. White played pawn takes on c5. This capture is possible because white is able to defend his king's pawn enough times. The next moves were black knight takes on c5, white bishop to c2, black knight to d7, white queen to e2, black queen to c7, white rook to e1, guarding the king's pawn for the third and last time. Black castled kingside. Perhaps you would like to switch off here and consider white's next move. White played 14 pawn to a3. His plan, which may not be the only one in this position, other good moves appear to be white knight to b3, or even white knight to f1, is to play white pawn to c4, attacking black's central position. But he does not want to allow the black knight in on b4, whereafter it might go to d5 after the exchange of c and d pawns. Black played pawn to f5, and white decided he had enough central control to allow himself to take the pawn. He played pawn takes on f6 en passant. Black knight takes on f6. And now please switch off and consider the position. One of the definitive games in this sort of position was Nimzowitsch-Salway, played perhaps 60 years ago. It dealt a rather heavy blow to the French. Nimzowitsch discovered that restraint was important, restraint of black central pawns, particularly the e-pawn. Control of the e5 and d4 squares was vital. I have given the game Nimzowitsch-Salway in the additional material supplied, but if you want Nimzowicz's actual notes, you will have to read his classic work, My System. In this position, white, with his rook and queen on the e-file, and his knight on f3, has considerable control over e5, and hence good prospects. White continued his plan with pawn to c4. Black king to h8. White pawn to b4. Black pawn takes on c4. White knight takes on c4. Black pawn to b5. White knight on c4 goes to e5. black knight takes on e5, white knight takes on e5. Black bishop moved to b7, and white bishop to b2. Black bishop to d5. Please switch off and consider this position. The last few moves have been fairly comprehensible, so I have not commented on them. White has an obvious advantage here, so it's not surprising that I declined black's offered draw. White here played bishop to d3, and black pawn moved to a6. Perhaps you would like to switch off and consider white's next move. White moved queen to e3. In order to transfer the queen along the third rank, perhaps to h3, they would both attack h7 and defend g2. Black moved bishop to d6, white rook on a1 to c1. Black queen to e7, white queen to h3. The pressure on black's game has now become intolerable. White's pieces have almost ideal positions, and he threatens knight to g6 check, winning the queen. Perhaps black should have captured on e5 here. Black bishop takes on e5. But after white rook takes on e5, black rook on a8 to c8, white rook on c1 to e1, there are threats of white rook takes on d5 and white bishop to f5, or even white bishop takes on h7, black knight takes on h7, and white rook to h5. So black's position looks pretty hopeless. Reset the white rooks on c1 and e1, the white bishops on b2 and d3, and the white knight on e5. Black rooks on a8 and f8, black's bishop on d6, black's knight on f6, and black's pawn on h7. Black played king to g8 here. White knight to g4, and black rook on a8 went to c8. You might like to switch off and find a continuation for white here. The win was pretty simple, but white simply missed it. It was white bishop takes on f6, black pawn takes on f6, and white knight takes on f6 check. Instead, white chose a method which just won a pawn. We set the white bishop on b2, the white knight on g4, black's knight on f6, and black's pawn on g7. White played rook takes on c8, black rook takes on c8, white knight to e3, threatening to go to f5 or to take on d5. So black played bishop to c4, and now white won his pawn. White bishop takes on f6. If now black pawn takes on f6, white knight to f5 is crushing. We place the black pawn on g7 and the white knight on e3. Black recaptured on f6 with his queen. Queen takes on f6. White queen takes on h7 check. Black king to f7. White queen to h5 check. Black king to g8. White bishop to g6. Here black lost his nerve. He was losing on time as well, and played king to f8. Had he played rook to d8, he would have resisted for quite a while. White played queen to h8 check, black king to e7, white queen takes on c8, and black resigned. On the previous side, we began with a pawn sacrifice. Then considered a line where white was allowed to do more or less what he liked in the opening, or transposed into positions known to be favourable to him. Finally, we considered whether black's move order could be improved to avoid any of these contingencies. In the lines with black pawn to e6, black's manoeuvre to cut across white's plans is to try and get in his own pawn to d5 first, before white has got in pawn to d4. Please switch off and set up the original position. Now play the moves 1. White pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black pawn to e6, white bishop to e2. At this point, black pawn to d5 would be premature. White would reply, pawn takes on d5, black pawn takes on d5, and white pawn to d4. Please switch off and consider this position. This is a similar position to the Tarrasch variation of the French defence, where black saddles himself with an isolated queen's pawn in exchange for active piece play. However, there is a difference in that white has not yet played pawn to c3 here, and can thus develop his knight on c3, with strong pressure on black's queen's pawn. So the trick for black is to play his pawn to d5 just after white has played pawn to c3, but before white has played pawn to d4. Please return to the initial position. Switch off if necessary. Playing in a club match against Jim O'Dell of Mitcham, the opening went like this. White pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black knight to c6, white bishop to e2, black pawn to e6, white castles, black queen to c7, white pawn to c3, black knight to f6. Now white found he couldn't play pawn to e5 here, and had to be satisfied with pawn to d3, to which black replied pawn to d5. A more promising sequence for white occurred in the game Basman-Lexton, Charlton Congress 1974. Please reset the initial position. The game went 1. White pawn to e4, black pawn to c5, white knight to f3, black pawn to e6, white bishop to e2, black queen to c7. Now white played pawn to c4 straight away, directed against black's possible pawn to d5. After black knight to c6, white opened up the game with pawn to d4, turning the game into fairly normal Sicilians. A few months later, against Kuraitsa, I delayed white pawn to d4 and played white pawn to d3, once again getting the better of the opening.
Sicilian with 3, bishop e2, tape 2, side 1. Now I left you in a bit of a mess on the end of the last tape where you had to try and defend your pawn at e5. Now, quite clearly, if you play pawn to d4, black will capture, c takes d4, and after, say, bishop f4, black can simply go pawn to d6 and completely destroy all your central bulwarks, and you get a lost game. So what I'm going to suggest to you is a different move, a pawn sacrifice, the move pawn to b4. And the intention here is for white to retain his central position at the cost possibly of a side pawn. Now if you look at this position, you'll see that black can play pawn takes on b4, knight takes on b4, or he can capture on e5. Those are the obvious moves. He does have others as well. Now if we look at the move pawn takes b4 first, the most direct move by black, and white's answer here should be pawn to d4. So he's being able to support his pawn at e5, and meanwhile you see the black knight at g4 is rather cut off. It even may be threatened by the move pawn to h3, and if it goes back to h6, white might play bishop takes h6 and double the black h-pawns. This is a possible threat. White has also other plans of playing, say, pawn to a3 and trying to open up the queen side. Apart from, of course, if the pawn at b4 goes, white might be able to play something like pawn to c4 and then move pawn to d5. So black has a few problems to think about. Now we're going to follow an illustrative game, and this happened at Woolacombe 1973, happened between Basman and Hutchins. Now in this game, black chose to play pawn to d5. The advantage of this move for him is that he prevents any white knight ever coming to e4. And this is quite important, because say if black plays something like pawn d6, he gets more pressure on the white e-pawn, but eventually a white knight may settle on e4, and then his black's d6 square may become quite weak. So pawn to d5, which is turning the game into a sort of French defense, where black has a blocked-in bishop. Now white here played the move pawn to h3. Black went knight back to h6, and white doubled the black pawns by playing bishop takes h6. Black pawn takes h6. Now white played his move pawn to a3 to open up the queen side. Now at this point black played queen to a5, and this probably showed up the weakness of white's strategy. We'll have to obviously think of improvements on it, because this queen pinned the pawn at a3, and white wasn't able to get ahead with his queenside expansion. Now white normally would try to play knight from f3 to d2, hoping to get it onto b3 and attack the black queen, and also to open the diagonal of his bishop on e2. Perhaps that bishop can go to h5, and white can play queen f3 and attack the black f-pawn. However, knight from f3 to d2 of course doesn't work, because the d-pawn is on prise. So white logically played his queen to d3 first. White queen to d3, black went bishop to d7, and white's knight from f3 did go to d2. So somewhat tortuously, white's trying to get his pieces into good squares. Black continued with rook to c8 here. And white now played knight to b3. Black went queen back to b6. The white bishop came to h5, very nice post for the bishop. But here black just played rook g8. an aggressive move, and he's planning to go to h7 with the g7 with the rook to defend the f pawn, and he doesn't mind that he loses a pawn. White took on h7, black played rook g7, white queen went back to d3. Now the position looks very unclear, but in my opinion it is better for black. Though the material is even, white's development is still hampered because he hasn't got his queenside pieces out, and really knights, if they want to work, they have to be off the back rank, and in fact white's knight on b1 stayed there for quite a long while. In fact, I think black could have caused serious difficulties to white by playing knight takes e5 here. White would play pawn takes e5, black would go bishop to b5 with a skewer, queen back to d1, and now bishop takes f1. White plays king takes f1. Here we get a position where black has got a rook against two white pieces, but the white pieces are not well developed. The knight has yet to come out, and this is why I feel that black may have the advantage. Also, the rooks have got good play on the open files. That c2 pawn looks rather weak. Say black now plays rook to g5, and if white plays pawn to f4, black can sacrifice. Rook takes h5, queen takes h5, rook takes on c2. This position, black is threatening mate on f2. If white blocks, say, by going knight from b1 to d2, black can play pawn takes a3. Here we've got an extra piece for white, but several black pawns. Let's see how many. 1, 2, 3, 4. Yes, 3 black pawns for black, and white's knights look pretty sickly. Well, I went into this long variation just to demonstrate that I wasn't satisfied with white's earlier play. So let's return to the position of diagram 4, and we'll invent a few improvements. Well, from diagram 4, after pawn to b4, pawn takes b4, pawn d4, black pawn to d5, instead of kicking the knight away immediately with pawn to h3, I think we should let it stew on g4 and carry on straight ahead with the pawn thrust, pawn to a3, to open things up on the queen side. And I think the problem white had in the last game was that he got rid of quite a strong bishop, and even though he doubled the black pawns, this wasn't sufficient compensation. And black's king stayed in the center, and even the black rook came out and did some useful work on the g file. Now, if white plays pawn a3 and black plays queen a5, white here could move his knight from f3 to d2. This would gain a tempo on the black knight at g4. Say black moves it back to h6, knight b3, queen b6. Now white is ready to take on b4. Now if he'd have done that in the last game, he got himself in a bit of a tangle because he had a queen on d3, and black would have been able to capture on b4, gaining a tempo against the white queen on d3. So here black's maneuver is just losing him time, and white's getting ready for his attack. Now, returning to diagram 4 again, I want to look at some of the other possibilities for black in this position. We've looked at pawn takes b4. Now let's look at knight from g4 takes on e5. This move looks quite good for white. White could take knight takes e5, black knight takes e5, and now pawn takes on c5. And here it's unfortunate for black, he can't recapture the pawn at c5 because white plays pawn to d4, a fork winning a piece. So white would be later able to play pawn to d4, and he would have some superiority in the center. So probably knight takes e5 is no good. Now, besides knight takes e5, we've got knight takes on b4. Now here white has a problem which I'm not sure how to solve. One possibility is to go pawn to c3 and then pawn to d4, in which case white does safeguard his pawn at e5. But there may be a more active move in playing pawn to d4 straight away. The idea here is that if black plays pawn takes on d4, white would be able to play queen takes d4, forking. Well, actually he doesn't fork a knight, he attacks one knight on g4, and the other one actually is defended. But he does allow black to play knight takes c2, in which case white would play queen takes g4, knight takes a1, and this is an exchange sacrifice by white, and I think he can justify it by, well, he can either play queen to e4 to stop black's knight coming out to c2, or he can immediately try to bring his knight to c3 and either to e4 or b5 to attack the black position, especially on the d6 square. I think this sacrifice is quite promising. Now, if black doesn't accept the exchange sacrifice, doesn't play knight takes c2, sorry, knight takes c2, so he moves his knight back to h6, then white would continue developing and defending at the same time. He can play knight a3, developing his knight with threats of coming into c4 and d6, also defends the c2 pawn. The idea of playing pawn to d4, by the way, immediately instead of pawn to c3, is that white may want to play his pawn up to c4 and then push through to d5, instead of taking, say, two moves and playing pawn to c3. So maybe pawn to d4 is a good move after knight takes b4. If, for example, after pawn to d4 black goes bishop e7, white could play pawn to a3, and now if knight c6, then pawn d5. Sorry, knight c6, first we play pawn h3, then pawn d5. Anyway, pawn a3, knight goes back, say, to d5, not to c6. Now we have our move pawn to c4, driving the knight away with gain of tempo, and then we'd be able to play pawn to d5. So that would be the idea behind playing this move immediately, pawn to d4. Now let's go back to diagram 4 again. Look at a more dangerous move. We seem to have looked at most of the moves, but we haven't looked at the move pawn to d6, which is a very unlikely looking move, but in fact it was played against me by Lichterink in 1976. I don't think I found the best reply. I lost the game quite heavily, and I've been thinking about it on and off ever since. Now, against pawn to d6, I'd like you to turn off the tape and decide how you would play for white in this position. Now, in the previous examples in this variation, we saw black gaining a pawn, but allowing white to gain his positional objectives, that is, of maintaining his central control and also of leaving the black knight offside. In this position, where black has played pawn to d6, black is trying to cut across those positional ideas. He wants to undermine white in the center, and he wants to provide his knight with a retreat, say back to either e5 or f6. Now against Lichterink, I played the move pawn takes d6 here, and instead of recapturing, black played pawn takes on b4. The result of this was that I lost a pawn, I didn't gain that much central control, and also black's knight wasn't sent back into the corner, it could go back to f6. I later played moves like pawn a3, black played bishop takes d6, pawn takes b4, black played bishop takes b4. And then I played something like pawn to d4 and pawn to c4. However, this central control didn't compensate for the loss of the pawn. Position is fairly fluid, but black managed to develop his pieces fairly well, and he won the game. Now let's go back to diagram 4, see if we can do better than that. After white's pawn to b4, black pawn to d6. I've suggested the idea of bishop to b5 in this position, but I'm not sure if it actually works. The line I worked out for black in reply was for him to play pawn takes on b4, white pawn to d4, black pawn takes on e5, white queen to e2. Now in this position it's dangerous for black to take on d4 with his pawn because of rook d1, and white gets a strong attack. But instead black can return his material by pawn to e4, white queen takes e4, black knight f6, and even though white wins a pawn back on c6, he falls behind in development, loses the two bishops, loses control of the d5 square, and really his game is quite inferior here. So back again to diagram 4. Here white plays, white plays his pawn to b4, black pawn d6, white pawn takes c5 is the move we're going to look at. Now black answers pawn takes on e5. Now you might like to turn off the tape here and decide how you would continue for white in this position. Now what white wants to do is to try and hold his pawn at c5, because this prevents black from developing his bishop on an active square. But if he plays bishop a3 straight away, black will just move in pawn to e4, and the white knight at f3 doesn't need to have many good squares to go to. So first we'd have to prepare our move bishop a3 by playing pawn to h3. Black moves his knight back to f6. Incidentally, black does have an idea here of playing pawn to h5, because if white plays pawn takes knight, black can play pawn takes pawn, and then if white moves the knight from f3, black has the mating idea of queen to h4 followed by queen to h1. Well, if black plays pawn to h5, I think white had better leave that knight for the time being, play possibly himself knight c3. If black plays bishop takes c5, then knight to e4. And then black either has to drop his bishop to e7, at which point white could take the knight because there isn't the mate threat with the black queen coming into h4, or if black plays bishop back to b6, white would be able to play bishop a3 and himself get a strong attack due to the threat of knight to d6 check. So that deals with the move pawn to h5 in reply to white's pawn to h3. If you got the right position, after pawn to h3, black plays his knight back to f6. Now again, bishop a3 is answered by pawn to e4, so white plays bishop to b5 here. This threatens to capture the pawn at e5. So if black plays bishop takes c5, white will play knight takes e5. Then if black say castles, white would take on c6. Black would play queen to b6. And I think white would play knight to c3. After pawn takes c6, white would play bishop back to d3. and this position is slight edge to white, because the black pieces must now retreat from b6 and c5. Oh, we had a little diversion there. So if you move the pieces, then go back to diagram 5 and add the moves h3, black knight to f6, white bishop to b5. So let's say black doesn't play bishop takes c5, he plays an obvious looking move, pawn to e4. White now does have a square for the knight, he can at least go forward with knight to e5. Now this position looks more promising for white. If black plays bishop d7, white would take the bishop off, black recaptures with the queen. Now bishop to a3, and white's bishops are tying black down, and also white will later be able to play knight c3, followed by queen e2, and attack the black pawn at e4. Now, instead of bishop to d7, black could try, say, queen to d5. This attacks the knight at e5 and also the pawn at c5. Possibly white should answer that by playing pawn to d4. And if black takes en passant, white can recapture with the knight. And he'll be ready to gain a tempo against the black queen by playing knight to c3. Of course, if black plays bishop takes c5, white will play knight takes bishop. White will play pawn c4, then knight takes bishop, and then bishop to a3. And again, his bishops will be very active against the black position. So let's look at some improvements for black. We'll go back to diagram 5, and we'll play again pawn to h3 for white. Black drops his knight back to f6, and white goes bishop to b5. Now, instead of pawn to e4, black could play bishop to d7. And now white shall play bishop a3 to hold his pawn at c5. Black now does play pawn to e4. And I think white should play bishop takes c6 here, though he could also consider moving his knight, say, to h2. But anyway, let's play bishop takes c6, black bishop takes c6, white knight to e5. Now, at this position, I'd like you to have a look at the consequences of black playing queen to d4. So turn off your tapes and have a look at that. Well, queen d4 looks very dangerous because it is an obvious fork. But white can play knight takes c6, black queen takes a1, and now the move I suggest is queen to e2. This has got threats of playing queen to b5, also threats of playing knight to c3. And if black plays pawn takes on c6, white will move his queen into a6 with a very strong attack against the black king. In fact, I think this is possibly a winning position for white. Now, returning to diagram 6, if you got that, after black's queen d4 and white plays knight takes c6, if black recaptures with the pawn, I think white should now play pawn to c3, because black still does retain one threat, and that is to play bishop takes c5, even though we've saved several of our pieces. So we play pawn c3, black queen d5, and now possibly white queen to b3. This looks like the only move to save the c-pawn. If black exchanges the queens, white recaptures a takes b3, with a very unclear ending, though I doubt if it's worse for white. example, if black plays knight d7 to attack white's c-pawn, white could play rook e1 to attack the black e-pawn. And black has got weak pawns at c6, and particularly at a7. If black played something like bishop e7, then that's instead of knight d7. Then I think white should liquidate the e-pawn by playing pawn to f3. And after black captures, rook takes f3. White's threatening to play pawn to pawn to d4, and bring his knight out to d2 and to c4. White's pawns look more compact than black's. So there seem to be quite a few interesting possibilities in the Lichterint line, and we await a few volunteers who will be prepared to try it out over the board. Having looked at the Lichterint line, I'd like to look at some other problems in the system. Now, when you play it, and say you get into the position after white plays pawn to e5, that's diagram 4. Now, instead of black playing knight to g4, as in diagram 4, you're quite likely to have your opponent move his knight to d5 instead. And this sort of position can arise in many forms. It may or may not have a black pawn on e6, and it may or may not have a black knight on e6. These are sort of optional extras. The important part is the black knight on d5 and the white pawn on e5. Now, what white wants to do here is to play pawn to d4, but in these circumstances it's not a good idea, not straight away, because black will just take the pawn, and it'll be hard for white even to regain this pawn. White also would like to drive the black knight away with pawn to c4, but at the moment this is also not really a good idea because of knight to f4. But the possibility of pawn to c4 is one that has to be borne in mind. Now, white's other problem is that though his pawn at e5 isn't immediately threatened with capture as in the last line, there is a threat for black to more or less equalize by playing pawn to d6 and liquidate white's main support in the center. And then white may even have a slight disadvantage in the center because black has a pawn at c5. Now, I've tried in this sort of position. This is diagram 4, but black knight not on g4 but on d5. I've tried playing moves like knight c3, and I think this is a possible idea. If black takes, knight takes c3, we can take with either pawn, possibly with the d pawn is more active, the d pawn, and then if black plays d5 we get a position akin to the French defense. Now, I'm not sure how much advantage white actually obtains from this sort of setup, so I'm going to suggest another move here, and this one hasn't been tried out, but the move is pawn to b3. This is instead of knight to c3. The idea being, of course, that if black wants to play pawn to d6, then he will open up the diagonal of white's bishop when it comes to b2, and also this bishop gives much needed support to the pawn if black wants to attack it. So after pawn to b3, black plays pawn to d6. White can play bishop to b2. I don't recommend bishop b5 yet because of bishop d7, and black has threats of knight takes e5, discovering against the undefended bishop. So bishop b2 looks to be the best way to play it. Now if black continues by taking off the pawn, pawn takes e5, white can play knight takes e5. I suppose white could also consider bishop b5 and taking on c6 and then playing knight takes e5. Let's play it in a straightforward way. Knight takes e5, black knight takes e5, white bishop takes e5. And here the black's problem is that he can't develop his bishop yet without white taking the g pawn. Now I must consider though that, let's say black wants to play aggressively, possibly he can play bishop to d6 here. Yes, at this point white is beginning to look behind in development. If he takes the pawn at g7, black plays rook g8, white bishop goes back to b2, and black can play queen to h4 with quite enough attack, certainly for a draw at least. On the other hand, after bishop d6, if white doesn't play bishop takes g7 and plays bishop to b5 check, black can go bishop to d7, and what will happen is white exchanges off most of his developed pieces, leaving black with the superior position. So it looks like pawn to b3 isn't a good suggestion. So let's return to diagram 4, and as before put black's knight on d5. Now another possibility for white, of course, is to play pawn c3 and pawn to d4. This would lead to positions similar to the Mora gambit, or the 2c3 variations of the Mora gambit. Now instead of that, let's have a look at the move white knight to a3. This is aimed to get the knight to c4, while it will control various important points at e5 and d6. And let's say if black plays the move pawn to d6 here, white can play knight c4. Black takes on e5. White takes, say, knight on f3, takes on e5. Black knight takes knight. White knight takes knight. Now at this point there seems to be a threat of bishop to b5 check. So it looks like black will play pawn to a6 here. And now I think white has to expand in the center with pawn to d4. If black goes bishop to, well, e7 looks best. Now pawn to c4, knight to f6. Maybe now bishop to e3, which looks like advantage to white in this position. However, let's go back to diagram 4 again, with the black knight on d5, not g4. The move knight a3 could also be met by d6, knight c4, and at this point, if black plays knight f4, it's hard to say what advantage white has, because black is going to eliminate white's bishop at e2, and will also be able to destroy the outpost at e5. Now if white plays d4, black has a choice. Well, he will take on e2 check, of course. White plays queen takes e2, and now if black could either play d5, going into a form of French defense, in which white has lost his white squared bishop to a black knight. He's lost his better bishop, and his knight at c4 also has been driven away. Also, black could even play pawn takes on d4, and after, say, bishop g5, queen c7, rook d1, maybe again pawn to d5 is the simplest move for black. So knight a3 to c4 doesn't look to be right, because the knight doesn't maintain itself on c4 after black's maneuver knight to f4, followed later by d5. So perhaps we should fall back upon a standard remedy, and from diagram 4 with the knight on d5, if we look at the move pawn to c3 more carefully. Now here black undermines the center with pawn d6, white plays pawn d4, and if black eventually wants to maintain his knight at d5, he'll take on d4. Pawn takes d4. White pawn takes d4. So black's knight at d5 is well supported, and in fact this position is almost identical to the game Basman Holloway, which is in the leaflet, except the white bishop is on e2, not d3, and on e2 it's slightly less exposed to knight maneuvers like knight to b4. Now also white's got firm hold of his pawn at e5. If black tries to, say, win it with queen c7, this won't succeed because of something like rook e1. So black develops with bishop e7. Now instead of knight c3, which may lead to a sort of continuation with black playing knight takes c3, pawn takes c3, and then pawn takes e5, and then exchanging the queens, after which, though white has got a pawn on e5, he's also got a weak pawn on an open file, his c3 pawn, which could be a disadvantage. Still, instead of that, we'll play, instead of knight to c3, we'll play bishop to d2. Black castles. Now white knight to c3. And here white has got the advantage of having this strong pawn at e5, and this means that black's bishop at d7 is shut in. In fact, I believe there's a game Basman against Carr from a few years back, which I think will be in the material in the booklet, which shows some play from this position. As I've said before, the lines where black plays knight f6 but not d6 and allows white to push on with pawn to e5 can turn up in many guises. The most common are the ones I've shown you. Let's look at some others. From the start position, white playing pawn to e4, pawn c5, knight f3, now knight c6, bishop e2, and here black can immediately play knight to f6. White plays pawn to e5, and now again black has the choice of knight d5 or knight g4. Now if he goes knight g4, we're not so worried after pawn to b4 that black can play pawn to d6. The reason is after pawn takes c5, black pawn takes e5, black has not already played pawn to e6, so he's not immediately threatening to take the pawn on c5, so this gives white an extra tempo to get his central play going, say by pawn h3, black knight f6, bishop to b2, and so on. So instead of black knight to g4, let's look at black knight to d5. White castles, and black played pawn to d6. White pawn takes on d6. This is the game Basman against Sherman from about 10 years back. Now black's got a choice of recaptures here. If queen takes, I think white will play pawn to d4. Now he can play pawn to e6, as was played against me by Bellin, or he can try the ambitious move pawn to e5. We'll look at this out of curiosity because it is an attempt to really refute white's system, so we must take it quite seriously. So turn off the tape and decide what you'd play as white here. Now over the board, as usual, I didn't find the right answer, but with hindsight I found some way to beat Sherman, though it was too late. Now the move I'm suggesting is to play pawn to d4 here. Seems crazy move, losing a pawn in 3 different ways, but the idea is to open up the position quickly against the black king. Now if black takes, for example, with c takes d4, white will be able to play the move pawn to c4, surprising move, but the black d pawn is now pinned, and when the black knight moves away, white will be able to play pawn to c5, and this shuts in the black position, and meanwhile white will bring up his forces. So that move doesn't look very good. C takes d4, and knight takes d4 fails for similar reasons. So e takes d4 is the suggested move. Now in this position, at first sight, it looks as though white can play rook e1, but then after queen takes d6, white doesn't necessarily have any good discovered checks in particular. So possibly more accurate is for white to play bishop c4, hitting the knight. Black plays queen takes d6, and now knight to g5. This has got sort of fried liver type threats on f7. You know, knight takes f7 and queen f3 check, attacking the knight at d5. So probably black's best bet is to play bishop to e6. Now, as an aside, if white had had a rook on e1, and say black had had a bishop on e7, here, the development of black would have been helped, because he would have been able possibly to castle in this sort of position and avoid the worst. But anyway, in this situation, as white hasn't played his rook to e1 check, black hasn't got this extra tempo, and in fact his king may have to seek refuge on the queen side. So after black's bishop e6, if white plays knight takes e6, pawn takes e6, queen h5 check, pawn to g6. Now the queen comes back to hit the pawn at e6 by queen to h3. Black say castles. Now rook e1. We can see white has got a very strong game for his pawn. Now besides this attempt by black to refute the system by playing pawn to e5 and cramp white's game, because if white doesn't have the move pawn to d4, he may have a rather passive position. Besides this, must look at lines where black is not aiming for so much, because this is going to be a very typical sort of formation which you'll meet. One example of this was the game Basman against Bellin, played in 1973 or 4. It's in the booklet. And from diagram 7, after e takes d6, we see that black didn't play pawn e5, he played pawn to e6. Now against Bellin, I chose some moves like d4, c4, then I exchanged on c5 and exchanged the queens, and then played pawn to a3 and pawn to b4, aiming for a queenside space advantage, which possibly may give white a slight edge, though in the actual game I certainly didn't get one, but in the later complications I managed to win the game. Now let's have a look at the position of diagram 7. One idea I tried was to play bishop to b5. Then if black goes bishop d7 to stop his pawns being doubled, white goes d4, black bishop takes d6, white c4, black knight to f6, white knight to c3, which seemed to be an edge for white. However, from diagram 7, after white's bishop to b5, black can improve by playing queen takes d6, and it's less clear that white is able to get any advantage out of this position. So let's return to diagram 7 again and see if we can improve in the Basman-Bellin game. If we play white pawn to d4, black bishop takes d6, white pawn c4, black knight to f6, white pawn takes c5, black bishop takes c5. Now against Bellin, as I said, I exchanged queens and then played a3 and b4, and I thought that the queenside majority should give me the advantage. Possibly I misplayed it anyway. Now, and instead of exchanging the queens, white could also play queen c2 or queen to b3, and he'll be preparing to play rook d1. Against that, black will probably have to play knight d4. Then white could take, black would take back with the queen. Now possibly knight to c3, with white seeming to have the superior position because of black's pieces which are exposed, and also his undeveloped position in general. Sicilian with 3 bishop e2, tape 2, side 2. Now, previous parts of the tape has shown that this opening can teach you something about the Ruy-Lopez, and also I've mentioned many times the French defense. There are many situations in which your opponent can lead you into a French defense type of position, and what you want to ensure is that you get a favorable sort of French defense. Now, first, before I look at a few examples of the opening, I think we should have a look at the French defense and see what in fact we're aiming at for white. Now, that would begin with pawn to e4, pawn to e6, d4, d5. Now, white has several moves here, knight d2, knight c3. I want to look here first at pawn to e5, and to show that though with this move white locks the pawn situation in the center, gains the space advantage, and also locks black's bishop in on c8, nonetheless it has disadvantages in black is able to set up a rapid counterattack against the white center. And we'll see how this happens. Pawn to c5, white pawn c3, black knight c6, white knight f3. At least the knight on f3 can't be pinned by bishop to g4, but still black is able to put pressure on the d4 square. He can go queen to b6 here. We won't look here at the Milner-Barry gambit, which is not that clear anyway. We'll look at the move bishop to e2, where white's just developing his bishop to e2, and then he's going to castle kingside. Of course, he could go bishop d3 because his d-pawn wouldn't be able to be captured yet because of the eventual check bishop to b5 check, netting the black queen. But bishop to d3 is nonetheless a sacrifice because black is able to answer bishop d7, and at that point the pawn on d4 is definitely under attack. At any rate, we're going to look at bishop e2 to see how the lines generally end up. Now black here captures on d4, c takes d4, and white cannot retake with the knight because his e-pawn would be unprise, so he retakes with the pawn. And now black's next move could be knight to h6. So this knight's threatening to come to f5 and very logically put pressure on the d-pawn. As we can see, black, if he can win a pawn, this will more than counterbalance the fact that he has a locked-in bishop. Now, white here has a choice of moves. If he plays bishop takes h6, there's a possibility of black queen takes b2. So white usually plays knight to a3 here, trying to move it round to c2 to defend his point on d4. And now comes bishop to b4 check. At this point, even white doesn't seem to have a good interposition. At least, doesn't seem to have one that doesn't lose his d-pawn. So he may even be forced to play king to f1 here. Now, I don't want to look further at this line, at the ins and outs of it. The example was only given to show that black often can get counterplay in the French against white's center. So what we'll be looking for are positions where our center is a lot more secure than this, and we're at least able, say, to castle before black gets his counterplay going. Now, the second idea in the French that I want to look at is one where black in fact manages to eliminate the white center, but still remains with the carcass of his own central position, that is his pawns at e6 and d5, and if white can prevent these from advancing, then white still retains an advantage because they prevent the black bishop on c8 from obtaining any scope, and also the squares in front of the pawns may provide outposts for the white pieces. These pawns, even though the pawns on e6 and d5 may in a sense be, as it were, isolated pawns, in the sense that they are immobilized and cannot protect the squares in front of them. Now, the game I want to look at here is a quite classic game, Nimzowitsch-Salway, and one should study this game carefully in order to understand the French. Now, if you have your pieces set up in the start position, we can play pawn to e4, pawn to e6, pawn to d4, pawn to d5, and now Nimzowitsch does play pawn to e5. Black plays pawn c5, white plays pawn to c3. Black knight c6, white knight to f3, black queen to b6. Now, in this particular position, white played the move bishop to d3, and, well, as I told you, the pawn isn't en prise. If black captures several times, eventually there's a bishop to b5 discovered check. Common tactical idea which would win the black queen. So black stops this by playing bishop to d7. Now, Nimzowicz's idea in this present game, and it's very important to have an idea when you play chess, even if the idea isn't 100% sound, at least if you have an idea, this leads your thoughts in a certain direction and gives shape to the game. So we're not going to discuss the merits of the idea from the point of view of modern grandmaster play, but anyway, we're going to say it is an idea and quite a good one. White here played pawn takes c5. Black played bishop takes c5, and white castled. Now here, what is white doing? He's given up half his center in order that he wouldn't have a target for black to hit at d4. And what's to stop black later playing pawn to f6 and liquidating the remainder of white's center and then remaining with a central majority? Well, let's see how Nimzowitsch solves this problem. Black, in fact, does play in the most uncompromising way. After white castles, black plays pawn to f6. White played pawn to b4 to drive the bishop back. Bishop went back to e7. And now white played bishop to f4. This seems to be the point of his playing pawn to b4 last move. The b pawn is not now en prise, and what Nimzowitsch intends to do is to occupy the squares in front of the e-pawn with pieces. So we must regard the e-pawn virtually as an isolated pawn, and in fact it is an isolated pawn. No pawns next to it, therefore there's no way that with pawns black can guard the e5 square once he's exchanged off his f-pawn. Now black did exchange off. He played pawn takes e5, otherwise he's not going to get his kingside pieces out. Pawn takes e5, white knight takes e5. Black knight takes e5, white bishop takes e5. And here we see white's bishop is occupying the square in front of the e-pawn, and thus the bishop on d7 is tied to the defense of the e-pawn and also doesn't have very good diagonals, whereas the two white bishops at e5 and d3 look very impressive. So here black does bring his kingside pieces out. He plays knight to f6. White goes knight to d2. This move is very interesting. The knight develops and also will come to f3, where it's going to look at two important squares for white, d4 and e5. At all costs, black's pawns should not be allowed to advance, particularly the e-pawn. So black castled, white played knight f3, black bishop to d6, and as many times as black offers to exchange off pieces, white always has something to recapture with. White plays queen e2, rook a to c8, bishop d4, queen c7, white knight to e5. Now I don't intend to go over this game further, because this is the exploitative part of the game. White has his advantage, but exploiting it, of course, isn't going to be that easy. Black's position isn't lost yet. So if you want to gain benefit from studying this game, I suggest you go through it, covering up white's moves and trying to guess them in advance. And this will give you some experience in trying to turn an advantage like this into a victory. Okay, now having looked at these two examples of play in the French defense, we're going to go back to the variation, the bishop e2 variation, and look at how these positions can also arise there. Now, if you have the position set up, start position, play the move pawn to e4, pawn to c5, knight f3, pawn d6, bishop e2, knight c6. White here played pawn to c3, and black, somewhat sleepily, moved his knight to f6, at which point white played pawn to d4. Now Bielek looked at the position, possibly worked out that he'd be losing a piece if he took on e4. Didn't look too carefully to see the queen a5 check, which he might flick in, and then eventually decided to play pawn to e6. So here he's already given white his opening strategical aim, which is to put two pawns straight up in the center. But this, of course, what is the advantage of it to white? As I said, it's maybe a half pawn advantage, and one needs a much bigger advantage than that to actually win a game. But anyway, it is a start. So we play our knight from b1 to d2 now to hold the pawn at e4. And now Bielek, with loss of time, we may note, played the move pawn to d5, offering to go into a French defense. Now, knowing the examples which we've already looked at, I of course accepted this offer because I realized I would be getting a French defense with a move in hand. So plays pawn to e5, white does. Black plays knight d7, and white castles. Now here, black's counterplay against the d4 square is much less. White has already castled, and well, let's see. Black played queen to b6 here. No, he didn't play queen to b6. He played bishop to e7 first. White went bishop to d3. This is a small loss of time for white, that he had to move his bishop twice, but it has been compensated by black's loss of time in playing pawn d6 and pawn to d5. And as I've said, white has already been able to castle, so his center is that much more secure. So bishop d3, black now did play queen to b6, with a threat on the pawn. White cannot answer this by playing knight to b3. That would be met by pawn c4. So white has to give up half his center, as in the example Nimzovich-Salway. So white played pawn takes c5. Black here didn't take with the bishop, he took with the knight. Knight takes c5. And white went bishop c2. Black dropped his knight back to d7. Black's assuming that his bishop on, if it had gone to c5, would have been misplaced anyway, so as we've seen in the previous example, it may have had to have been driven back by b4. So he decides his bishop should be better on e7. So now the e-pawn is now attacked twice, and white defends this. Queen to e2. Black plays queen to c7. Now this is three bits attacking. White defends with rook to e1. Very important in the French. If white's been able to castle, then his rook can come to e1 and guard the e-pawn. If he hasn't, then he may lack pieces to defend his advanced pawn. So now it's 3-3, and white has in fact won the battle for the time being. Black castles. Now I'd like you to turn off the tape and decide how you would play as white here. Well, my choice here was to aim to play pawn to c4 to further increase my central advantage by knocking out the black d-pawn and possibly then being able to use the e4 square. Also, if we play this move pawn to c4, the whole black central position will be that much more insecure. I think there are, of course, other ways to play it. For example, play knight to b3 and move the knight round to d4. This might be a positional way of continuing the game. Now, if I play pawn to c4 straight away, there are moves like knight to b4 coming up. So first I played pawn to a3. Black now played pawn to f5. This is offering me a choice to keep the position blocked or to capture on f6. So which would you choose? Well, usually when one has the advantage, one has to open up the position. And this is why white has to play pawn takes on f6, even though it also gives black's pieces a lot more activity than they previously had. However, the pawn on f5, if it remains there, would block white's kingside attacking chances, and also black might later be able to move his knight from c5 into e4. And for these reasons, white therefore plays pawn takes on f6 en passant. Black now recaptures, knight takes f6, typical maneuver because the knight in recapturing causes the e-pawn to be guarded by the bishop at c8. But the most important thing for white here is that he hasn't lost superiority on the e5 square, and therefore black isn't going to be able to play pawn to e5 and free his bishop. So after knight takes f6, white played pawn to c4, and black played king to h8. He's beginning to feel a bit insecure on that diagonal. Maybe there isn't a threat of queen takes e6 check, but there may well be one day. So king to h8 was played. White played pawn to b4. And white's going to try to set up his bishop on b2, shooting straight across the board and also controlling the e5 square. And this will cause an attack to be unleashed eventually. So pawn to b4, black took on c4. He doesn't want to, but he's got to get some play somehow. So pawn takes c4, white knight takes c4. Black pawn went to b5. White knight went to e5. Black took on e5. White took on e5, and black played bishop to b7. Here I'd like you to turn off your tapes and study the position for some time. Well, it's always helpful if you do your own thinking about these positions. Otherwise you're just taking things in passively and not really learning. So that's why I ask you to switch off now and then. Now black's pawn on e6 is weak, but we can't quite get at it unless we move our knight away, so we're just going to have to leave it there. We can't take the pawn on b5, of course, because our c2 bishop is hanging. But still, we can see that white does have this strong advantage. Very powerful knight on e5, and possibilities of attack against this black king coming up. White played bishop to b2, and black played bishop d5. This was a very good move. The bishop defending the pawn on e6, and black is possibly getting back into the game here. But still we can see that white has much the superior position. Very well placed pieces in the center. Now white now played bishop to d3. Black played pawn to a6. Perhaps you'd like to turn off your tapes here again and decide how you'd play as white. Now this decision for white isn't that easy to make, his next move, and it should show you that even good positions have to be played well if you want to get anything out of them. If you play some automatic moves like rook c1, then maybe queen to b7 would attack your pawn at g2, and then black would possibly be able to play rook to c8 later and try to exchange off some pieces. Then the more pieces coming off, the less advantage you might notice. So instead white chose to play queen to e3. He'd have liked to have played queen to rook 5, queen to h5, but knight takes queen is too strong against that. But by playing queen to e3, only moving the queen one square, he is then going to be able to move it over to either g3 or h3, and his attack is going to look very strong. So queen to e3 is the powerful move here. Black played bishop to d6. White went rook ac1. Black played queen e7. White played queen h3, threatening, of course, knight g6 check. Here black played king to g8. White now moved his knight from e5 to g4, putting pressure on the knight at f6, which is the defender of the f7 square. Black moved his rook from a8 to c8. Now, I wonder if you would like to try and work out the tactics in this position. So turn off the tape and decide on your move. Well, the correct way to play is bishop takes f6. If black plays rook takes c1, hoping for bishop takes queen, when he can play rook takes rook check and escape from most of his troubles. If black plays rook takes rook, white would mate in 2 by queen takes h7 check and bishop to g6 mate. So black has to take with the pawn, and white will play knight on g4 takes f6 check. And if black takes back with the queen, it's queen takes h7 mate, and if black takes back with the rook, white will win the exchange by simply rook takes rook check. So this is a fairly simple combination, which anyone of normal intelligence should be able to see. Anyway, I didn't see it and played instead rook takes rook. And black played rook takes rook. And now white's combination doesn't work, because if he plays, say, bishop takes f6, pawn takes f6, knight takes f6 check, black can recapture with the queen, and queen takes h7 is not mate, and the king would go to f8, and white hasn't even got queen h8 check afterwards, because the queen on f6 defends that square. So white has to backpedal a bit, which he did. He played his knight from g4 to e3, which has got some quite nasty ideas involved in it. One of them is to play, say, knight f5, Another would be to play knight takes d5, because if black recaptured with the pawn, white would play queen takes rook check. And on the other hand, if black took with the knight, then the h7 pawn would fall. So, faced with these threats, black found the defense bishop to c4, and he's intending to answer knight f5 simply by moving his queen to d7, and then if white took on d6, black could take with the queen, and then black would be threatening the bishop at d3. So this wouldn't work. Therefore, instead of knight f5, white played bishop takes f6. And here, black did not recapture with the g-pawn, which wouldn't have been very good, because white could then play knight f5, black queen to d7, and now knight takes d6. Now if bishop takes d3, then knight takes c8, or if queen takes d6, the h7 pawn would fall, and in fact also the rook would fall, because white would get a skewer against the rook on c8. This is an important theme in this position, the undefended nature of the rook at c8, vulnerable to a skewer. Now, in answer to bishop takes f6, black had to recapture with the queen, giving up a pawn, but ensuring some counterplay. White played now queen takes h7 check, king f7, queen h5 check, king to g8, bishop to g6. Now I wonder how you feel black should answer in this position. How would you play as black here for a change? Well, the way black played was disastrous. He played king f8, queen h8 check, king e7, and white did win his exchange by queen takes c8. But black could have put up a better defense by playing rook to d8, say. And it's quite interesting here that if white tries the combination knight f5, because the trouble with white's position is now he hasn't got a skewer and black's got an escape square at e7. Now if white plays the combination knight f5, hoping for pawn takes knight, black in fact does play pawn takes knight, because after queen h7 check, queen h8 check, this isn't mate, because the bishop from c4 drops back to g8. So knight f5 wouldn't work. Possibly rook d1 is a good idea. It does actually have the threat of a combinative mate by rook takes d6, followed by queen h7, h8, and then queen to e8. So maybe that would have been the right answer for white. White's a pawn up, but he hasn't yet forced a clear win out of the position. Now, I'd like to wind up this tape by looking at a few sidelines. I can't prime you for everything, but I can give you an idea of some of the typical problems which may arise when you play this opening. So, we'll look at my game against Odell. This went e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e2, and black plays pawn e6, white castles. Now, first I want to look at black playing pawn to d5 here. This occurred in a 1982 game, Basman against Levitt, from the ARC Masters. Black went pawn to d5, white took on d5. Now black's got a choice. He can take with the pawn or the queen. Now if he takes with the queen, I don't think it's much use for white just to automatically gain piece development by playing knight to c3, because he doesn't solve his main problem of playing pawn to d4. So perhaps you should aim for the type of position we've looked at before in the tape. If he plays, say, pawn to b3, black knight f6, bishop b2, black bishop e7. Now instead of knight c3 we can play pawn to c4. This denies the black knight on f6 the square at d5, increases our space advantage. Black plays queen to d8 and white is able here to play pawn to d4. If black captures, white will recapture with the knight and the bishop and then play knight c3 with some space advantage, so possibly black will castle in this position. Now, it doesn't seem that white has a good continuation here, because he can't develop his knight normally to c3 without losing the d pawn. So it looks like we'll have to ditch that line. Let's go back to the position after black played queen takes d5. Possibly we can play here bishop to b5, and the idea being that black's queen, if black plays bishop d7 here, black's queen will be lacking in squares when white goes knight to c3 and may have to start wandering around instead of going straight back to d8. So if black plays bishop d7, knight c3, queen comes to h5, the queen's a lot more exposed there. White may play something like knight e4. There's threats of knight g3, for example. Now let's look again at this position after queen takes d5 and white trying bishop to b5. Black plays possibly pawn a6. Now we might get a sequence with white playing knight c3. Black wants to keep his queen guarding the knight, so he plays queen d6, knight e4, queen d7. Now I think white must part with his two bishops. Bishop takes c6 check, queen takes c6. White also hasn't gained any advantage in doubling the pawns. He hasn't been able to double them, but he does have this development lead. Possibly if he plays rook e1, I think he's doing well, because he will be able to play pawn to d4, and the black queen, of course, is not well placed on c6. It's exposed to a possible attack by the knight. So I should consider this as a good position for white. Now let's return again to the position after white plays e takes d5. And black, in the game Basman Levitt, did not take with the queen. He took back with the pawn. And we get this isolated queen pawn type of position about to arise, very similar to the Tarrasch variation of the French defense. So white played d4, and black in the game took off on d4, pawn takes d4. White played knight takes d4, black played bishop to d6. White now moved knight to c3, and black moved knight ge7. So white's been able to develop his knight to c3, attacking the black d pawn more strongly than happens usually. Now, after knight g7, white played bishop f3, still putting pressure on the pawn. Probably black should have played bishop e5 here, but he castled, and now white played knight from d4 to b5. So now white is going to attack the black bishop at d6. If black plays bishop e6, which he had to play to defend his pawn, white plays knight takes d6. This is what happened. Black played queen takes d6. So it seems that white's got two advantages. One is the isolated pawn, and the other is that he has the two bishops. On the other hand, black has got this space advantage and very good development. He'll be able to get his rooks to the open files. So the position is not clearly in white's favor, though in the long term it should be. We can't really be too sure. Now, after queen takes d6, white could have played slowly by moving his knight to b5 and then into d4, blockading the position. He chose instead to play pawn to b3. Black went rook c8, rook ac8 that is. White went bishop b2. Black played rook fd8. White played rook e1, black played pawn to a6. White moved queen to d2, black's knight went to f5. White played rook from a1 to d1, both sides mobilizing. And now we come into the crunch. Black's knight from f5 went to d4, and white played his bishop from f3 to h5. Now white's trying to move his bishop out of the way, and his next idea is going to be to move his knight to a4, attacking the black knight at d4, or the knight may threaten to come in on b6. And instead of defending meekly, black played the move bishop from e6 to f5. You might like to turn off your tapes and decide what you do for white in this position. Well, probably your best move is just to play the rook from d1 to c1. It doesn't look a very exciting move, but white has got this long-term advantage that his bishop lurking on b2 gives him in the position, and black then will have to decide how he defends against white's threats of playing either knight e2 or knight to a4, just starting to exchange the pieces off, and gradually, when the position is a bit more simplified, the isolated pawn will start to tell in a weak sense. Now instead white went for complications with knight to e2, and he didn't get the best out of them actually. After knight to e2, black played knight takes c2, white went to g3, hitting the bishop. The bishop had to go back to g6. White played bishop takes g6, queen takes g6. And now white plays rook to e2. Again, how would you play in this position? If you're black, you're threatened with capture on c2, your knight is threatened with capture. So is there any defense here? Well, moving the knight to b4 isn't much of a defense, because pawn to a3 will straight away incarcerate it at a2, and I don't think it's going to get out. But black does have a combinative move here to save his position. He can play pawn to d4. Now, I hadn't missed this move, but I thought that the black knight was still trapped on c2, and that I would be able to take advantage of it later. However, this was not true. I played pawn to h4, and even in this position, I noticed that black has a good move in possibly playing knight to e3, because if pawn takes knight, the white knight on g3 goes. After pawn to h4, in fact, black played pawn to h5, and I exchanged queens by queen to g5. Now this game was later won by white, quite remarkably, but only because black failed to play carefully enough, a couple of pawns up in the ending, and white in fact managed to get a mating attack going. As for understanding of the opening, it shows that black still gets very dangerous play, even though he has lost a couple of positional advantages. But still I feel that if white had moved his rook from d to c1, the long-term chances are with him. Now, having looked at the possibility of these isolated queen-pawn positions arising, we'll go back to our original idea. This was e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop e2, pawn to e6, black castles. Now, if at this point black doesn't play pawn to d5, he can play knight to f6. We've looked at those lines. A game of mine against Odell, 1974, black played queen to c7 here. Now, the idea of this is to be able to play knight to f6 without allowing pawn to e5. I believe in the actual game I played pawn to c3, and after knight to f6 I had to play pawn to d3, so that didn't work too well. Had I played rook to e1, black could have played knight f6, and then if bishop f1, black could now play pawn to d5, and if white plays pawn to e5, black could move his knight to d7, and this is the sort of position we wish to avoid. It's one which is similar to a French defense, but white's pawn on e5 has already been cut off, and black has got a lot of spatial advantage on the queen side with the pawns at d5 and c5. I mean, white can defend the pawn by playing queen to e2, but even in this position, the move pawn to g5 comes into consideration for black, trading his side pawn for white's e-pawn. And of course, as white has castled, black doesn't mind opening up the position on the king's side against the white king. Now, a little later in the same year, there was the game Basman Opening, where the same first moves were played, and after 3 bishop e2, black played queen to c7 immediately, preparing this move knight f6. White answered this by playing the move pawn to c4, which possibly doesn't tie in with his previous plans, but then on the other hand, black has played his queen to c7. Therefore, when white plays knight c3, black will have to play the moves a6 and e6, possibly to safeguard his queen. Therefore, there is a possible development plus for white in that position. So white played pawn to c4, and then after knight f6, white is able to play knight to c3, and he's going to attempt to get a Maroczy bind, the Maroczy bind being pawns at e4 and c4, preventing black's freeing maneuver pawn to d5. Of course, white needs to be able to play pawn to d4 himself to increase the pressure on the center, but it seems black won't be able to prevent that unless he plays, as in the game against Kawaitza. Kawaitza played the move pawn to e5, leading to a almost perfectly symmetrical position in the center, except black's queen on c7 can't be all that well placed because it may be hit by a later knight d5. Now after pawn to e5, white castled, black played bishop to e7, white moved pawn to d3, and black castled. And now white moved his knight from f3 to e1. One has to think about pawn breaks in these sorts of positions in order to open up files for the rooks, and the natural pawn break is going to be pawn to f4. Looks like black can't stop it. Also, white's knight, though it's retreated, will have some future. It can either go, say, to g2 and to e3, or it can go to c2 to e3, maybe into d5 later. So the knight has got some point. It's not very well placed at the moment on f3. So knight e1, black played pawn d6, white played his pawn f4, and this looks like a superior position for white because he's been the first to open up the file. So pawn f4, pawn takes f4, bishop takes f4, bishop e6, white knight to c2. Well, the game later became a little wild, but final result was a win for white, though I'm not actually sure he had the advantage in the middle game. Still, this opening position looks certainly very promising for him. Shows that in this sort of opening, though one does have a plan, one doesn't need to stick to it too rigidly, and there are different pawn configurations which one can choose to play as white. So I hope that you'll be able to score some successes with this opening, and it will in fact be for you a complete answer to the Sicilian defense.